Approximately 2 years ago, I moved into a new apartment with thin walls. Due to fire safety regulations in my city, my bedroom had a window that led into the living room, but there were no windows with outside access. This detail becomes relevant later. The apartment had 3 bedrooms, one for me, one for the master tenant, and a spare room that was initially occupied by a friendly guy. However, the friendly guy encountered work visa issues and had to unexpectedly move back to Canada, leaving us with only 2 weeks to find a new roommate. Given my work schedule, I had no involvement in the selection process, but I was satisfied when the new roommate moved in. He seemed a bit peculiar, but generally friendly. He was a tall, large man who was rather quiet. Not someone I actively sought to spend time with, but I was okay with being cordial. Around 2 weeks after his arrival, the master tenant left for a month-long trip to Hawaii, leaving me alone with the new roommate, whom I'll refer to as Kyle. Initially, everything seemed normal, but after 4 days into the trip, I was abruptly awakened at 8 a.m. by frantic knocking at my door. When I opened it, I found Carl looking disheveled and anxious. He stared directly into my eyes and asked me to explain what happened the previous night. I was taken aback and confused, because I had returned from work around 9 p.m., immediately showered, and went to bed. I explained this to Kyle, but he insisted that he heard me screaming and arguing with someone in my room. He claimed to have seen me arguing with our landlord through the window in the side alley, despite the fact that I had never even met the landlord at that point. Carl also mentioned hearing people entering and leaving our apartment. I assured him that none of those events had occurred. After scrutinizing me for a while longer, Carl left without bringing it up again. However, the following morning, the same scenario repeated itself. This time, he accused me of arguing with my non-existent boyfriend and claimed to have seen me conversing with our other roommate, who was in Hawaii. He even asked for the badge number of the officer I had allegedly spoken to, as he had apparently witnessed me speaking with several police officers. I became angry and firmly told him to stop making baseless accusations, emphasizing that I was innocent and had no idea what he was talking about. Carl's expression turned strange and he murmured, "I think I had a seizure in my sleep. If it happens again, call an ambulance." After a while, he left but returned an hour later, knocking on my door once more. When I opened it, Carl repeated the exact same story as before, word for word. This unsettling cycle occurred multiple times, until I finally told him to leave me alone and left for work. I went to work as usual, but felt hesitant about returning home that night. However, due to exhaustion, I reluctantly went back to the apartment, which turned out to be a grave mistake. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of slamming doors. Carl was pacing back and forth between his room, the living room, and the front door. He repeatedly walked in and out of each room, flicking the lights on and off, muttering angrily, and slamming doors. Through the frosted window in my room that faced the living room, I could see his figure pacing, unaware that I was awake in the dark room. Suddenly, he screamed, "I can't live like this. Why are you doing this to me?" I assumed he was on the phone and chose not to respond. Moments later, he shouted my name repeatedly, and I realized he was directing his anger towards me. Terrified, I remained motionless in my bed, not making a sound. Eventually, he screamed my name again, moved away from the window, and resumed pacing between rooms. Realizing this might be my chance to escape, I quietly got out of bed, quickly got dressed, and packed a bag with clothes for work the next day. Just as I was finishing, he screamed, and I heard him charging towards my room, slapping the wall beside my door without touching the door itself. I looked towards the window and saw his shadow leaning forward, pressing his ear against the glass. I was petrified and stayed completely still, not daring to move. After a moment, he screamed my name once more, moved away from the window, and resumed pacing between rooms. Sensing a temporary calm, I made a decision. I grabbed my shoes, still holding them in my hand, and cautiously opened my door. Stepping out, I hurriedly put on my shoes, preparing to run. As I formulated my plan, his pacing suddenly ceased. He shouted, "Do you want to fight about this? Come out right now, and we'll fight, I swear to God." Given his towering size compared to my small frame, I had no intention of engaging in a physical confrontation. After a few minutes, he switched off all the lights, and I heard his bedroom door open and close. Silence enveloped the apartment. Seizing the opportunity, I waited for a moment to ensure there was no movement before taking my chance. I opened the door swiftly, stepped out, and grabbed my shoes, ready to make my escape. To my dismay, I saw him standing in the hallway, shirtless, wearing only boxers and socks, blending into the darkness. His arms hung awkwardly at his sides. In a low, calm voice, he said, "Ma'am, we need to talk." Fearing for my safety, I disregarded his words, clutched my shoes tightly, and ran out the door, leaving them in my hand. I sprinted barefoot for about half a block, before stopping to put on my shoes. When I glanced back, I saw Carl standing in the porch light, observing me as I fled, but he made no attempt to pursue me. Fortunately, I had a friend who lived 2 blocks away and had a spare key to their place. I let myself in and stayed there for the night. For the following week, I stayed at my friend's place while sorting things out with the master tenant. Eventually, Carl agreed to move out within a week. He claimed not to remember anything that had transpired, or wasn't sure if it was real or imagined, but he trusted my account of the events. On the day he left, he sent me a photo of the house key resting on the table and simply stated, "I'm out," to ensure he had truly departed. I brought a friend along to check the apartment. Much to our surprise, we discovered that Carl had left behind a considerable amount of food and furniture. He had also removed all the fire alarms from the ceilings and neatly lined up the unscrewed deadbolts on the front table. It became apparent that my front door could only be locked from the outside using a key, and it had been locked when we arrived, indicating that Carl still had a key. We immediately called a locksmith, changed the locks, but even then, I remained terrified to stay there alone. I never slept at night without barricading the doors with chairs and other pieces of furniture. To this day, I still worry about Carl's well-being. It was evident that he was mentally unstable. I often wonder what might have happened if luck had not been on my side. When I was accepted into a college far from my hometown, I didn't have any acquaintances in that area. Although the college didn't provide dormitories, they suggested that students live in nearby apartments. Being short on money and eager to meet new people, I decided to rent an apartment based mainly on their roommate matching service. This service involved filling out a questionnaire about my demographics and interests, and they would find compatible roommates for me. Despite seeing one-star reviews for the particular apartment I chose, I ignored them, assuming that the recent change in management and the one-year lease couldn't make it that bad. I was matched with another guy for a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment, and I was excited about moving in and getting to know him. I moved in a few days after the lease started, approximately 3 weeks before the beginning of the school term. However, my excitement quickly turned into regret. The apartment had a moldy smell, and it seemed to be permeated with the stench of old cigarettes. In fact, there was a used ashtray on the coffee table when I arrived. My new roommate didn't show up for about a week, and when he finally did, I discovered that he was around 35 years old and didn't even attend the same college as me. He had a scruffy appearance and carried the odor of stale cigarettes and body odor. I later learned that he used to be homeless and took out student loans to pay for the application fee and initial rent, although he never actually enrolled in classes. After a few months, he stopped paying rent, and it took the property management approximately 6 months to finally evict him. During his stay in the apartment, he never changed his clothes and always wore the same worn-out camouflage pants and dirty tank top. Even when I offered him some of my clothes that would have fit him, he declined. He often had his former roommates from homeless shelters over, and it was not uncommon to come home to a random person doing laundry, even in my roommate's absence. Whenever I had a guy visit me in my room, I noticed my roommate watching us through the crack in his door, which sent shivers down my spine every time. He had the creepiest expression on his face. A few months after the start of the school term, as I increasingly noticed his disturbing behavior, I was in my room asleep with a guy I was seeing at the time when I heard a knock on my bedroom door. I checked the clock, and it was around 3 a.m. I got up to see who it was and opened the door to find a random, dirty, and naked guy standing there. He claimed to be a friend of my roommate and assumed my roommate was with me in my room. Naturally, I freaked out because my roommate wasn't in my room. For someone to enter the apartment, my roommate would have to let them in, and since the apartment was small, there was nowhere he could have gone without his friend knowing his location. He was either in the living room or in his own room. I kicked the stranger out and entered my roommate's room, which was the first time I had been there. I had no reason to associate with him, but I needed answers. He was sitting in the corner, doing absolutely nothing with his lights off, almost as if he were waiting for me to enter. I questioned him about the incident, but he played dumb, acting as if he didn't know the guy. Someone had to let him in, and it certainly wasn't me. Although I dropped the subject reluctantly, eviction notices were accumulating on his door, and I figured it was only a matter of time before he would be gone. Meanwhile, I encountered the naked guy randomly in the apartment a few times, doing laundry when I returned from classes. Finally, my roommate was evicted, and I thought I was done with the situation. I hoped we would get another roommate my age, who would be cool to live with. A few quiet weeks passed, but one day, during daylight hours, I heard a knock at the front door. When I answered, I saw the naked guy standing there, thankfully dressed this time, holding a trash bag filled with what appeared to be disgusting laundry. He claimed that my roommate said it was fine for him to come, and used the washing machine, attempting to enter as if he owned the place. I stood in front of him, informing him that his friend no longer lived there and, no, he couldn't use my washing machine. I closed and locked the door, returning to my room. Approximately 20 minutes later, I continued hearing an odd noise from my balcony. Since I lived on the 3rd floor, I assumed it was a squirrel or bird scratching around. However, as the noise persisted, I decided to investigate. To my surprise, I discovered the homeless guy struggling to climb up to my balcony. I threatened to call the police, but by the time they would have arrived, he had disappeared. On that same day, I approached the property manager and questioned the effectiveness of their roommates' matching service. I demanded to be released from my lease after a heated discussion, ultimately convincing her that it would be in her best interest to let me leave. I found a nice one-bedroom apartment and never looked back. Back in 2014, I experienced an incident during my last stay on a psychiatric ward after a suicide attempt. To provide some context, I am a female and was 19 years old at the time. I had been on bipolar medication for 3 years, but I was also heavily involved in substance abuse. Influenced by the newfound freedom of my first year in college. On that particular night, I had a significant mental breakdown, leading to my first admission in the adult ward. Previously, I had only been admitted to the adolescent ward for similar episodes. In this unit, roommates were assigned based on gender, but there were no formal introductions. The overall management of the facility was ineffective, and the nurses and doctors seemed indifferent, except for their duties of prescribing medications and discharging patients quickly. Upon arrival, the nurse simply told the other woman in the room that I was her new roommate and then left. The woman, who appeared to be in her late 40s or early 50s and of Hispanic descent, kept her gaze fixed on the floor, remaining silent and motionless when I greeted her. I noticed she had a tattoo of a baby version of the classic Red Devil cartoon, so I decided to give her space and stick to my area of the room. The first night followed the typical routine of a psychiatric ward. My roommate continued her pattern of not sharing anything, still fixated on the floor and barely moving. Meanwhile, chaos erupted in a neighboring ward. People started banging on the glass door, screaming, and engaging in bizarre behavior. One individual even smiled while repeatedly banging his bald head against the window. Eventually, the orderlies arrived and took them away, but their screams echoed through the halls. Having been in psych wards before, I was accustomed to outbursts and disruptive behavior, but this situation felt different. I was now surrounded by disturbed adults, with years of mental illness deteriorating their minds. It made me genuinely afraid for the first time, due to the heightened unpredictability of these individuals. Despite my own mental health struggles, these people made it challenging for me to find any rest at night. You know that hazy state between waking and still having your eyes closed? That half-conscious state where everything seems fuzzy. That was my state of mind when I felt something rousing me from sleep. However, I remained tired and kept my eyes shut. As I gradually regained consciousness, I sensed pressure on my forehead and I felt drops of sweat falling on my face. Startled, I opened my eyes to find my roommate standing over my bed, locking eyes with me. She had one hand on my forehead and the other clenched in a fist against her chest while speaking in what seemed to be tongues. Her eyes were vacant, devoid of any emotion, while she continued speaking faster and louder. I was paralyzed in that moment, unsure of what to do or how she would react if I yelled or moved. We were alone in the room, and the nurse's station was at the far end of the hallway. Persisting in her erratic behavior, she wiped the sweat off my forehead while still speaking incoherently. I had no idea what she was attempting, or what her intentions were. Suddenly, she placed both hands on my forehead and started screaming while shaking me. Before long, a nurse rushed in and pulled her away from me. However, the nurse seemed more irritated by the disruption than concerned about my well-being. She escorted the woman out, casually instructing me to go back to sleep. Miraculously, I managed to fall back asleep. I assumed the woman was transferred to a more secure ward, because I never saw her again the following day. Fortunately, I was able to leave the facility later that day. This incident serves as a constant reminder for me to prioritize my mental well-being and never return to such an environment. While I still struggle with my own mental health issues, I am grateful that I am not in a far worse state of mind. Some nights, I still wake up with residual anxiety and have to calm myself down in order to go back to sleep.